in the spring of 2024 at the livestock auction house in Caddo County, Oklahoma. A woman walked through the gates with 3 miniature bulls on halters that she had raised from stock everyone else had called worthless. The auctioneer, a man who had been selling cattle in that ring for 31 years, stopped mid-sentence when he saw them. The crowd went quiet. Then the bidding started. $8,000. $10,000. $15,000. When the gavel fell, those 3 animals that had once been labelled unmanageable, dangerous and demonic, had just sold for more money per head than any full-size Angus in the county. The woman standing in that ring, watching grown men fight over animals they had once laughed at, was Sarah Mitchell. And if you had told anyone in this town 3 years earlier that Sarah would be standing there, debt-free, holding the reins to the most profitable cattle operation in the region, they would have called you a liar. Because 3 years earlier, Sarah had done something that no one in her family had done in 4 generations. She had sold the dairy. She had taken the money, the last financial asset her late husband had left behind, and she had driven to a backroad clearance auction in the Texas Panhandle, where livestock too problematic for commercial sale got dumped for pennies on the dollar. And there, in a muddy pen, while rain hammered the tin roof, she had pointed to 3 miniature bulls with eyes like black marbles, and she had said, "I'll take the demons." The auctioneer had laughed. Her father-in-law had cried. Her banker had called the next morning, and for the next 18 months, it looked like they were all right. But here's the thing about demons. Sometimes, what looks like a demon is just something that nobody has figured out how to love yet. And Sarah Mitchell was about to prove that to an entire county. To understand why that moment in the auction ring mattered so much, you have to understand what Sarah had lost. And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about the ground beneath her feet. The Mitchell family dairy had been operating on the same 200 acres outside of Anadarko, Oklahoma, since 1987. Sarah's father-in-law, Earl Mitchell, had built that milking parlor with his own hands after coming back from the oil fields with a bad back and a dream. He had poured the concrete in August heat so thick it felt like soup. He had installed every stall, every water line, every fan. And when his son David married Sarah in 2009, Earl didn't just gain a daughter-in-law, he gained a partner. Sarah wasn't a farm girl when she arrived. She had grown up in Oklahoma City, worked retail, thought she wanted an office job. But David had this way of making the land sound like a promise. And within 2 years, Sarah knew every cow by name. She could tell you which ones were due to calve by the way they stood at the fence. She could spot mastitis before the vet could. The dairy wasn't just a business. It was a language she had learned to speak fluently. Then came the winter of 2021. David was moving a hay bale in the north pasture when the loader hit a soft spot. The machine rolled. By the time Sarah got the call, the helicopter was already in the air. But David never made it to the hospital. He was 34 years old. And in the space of one afternoon, Sarah went from being a wife and partner to being a widow, a single mother to 2 children under 8, and the sole operator of a dairy farm that was already drowning. That was tragedy number 1. The personal earthquake that cracks your world in half. But tragedy has a way of bringing friends, and tragedy number 2 was already waiting at the gate. The dairy market in 2021 wasn't just bad. It was catastrophic. Large processing contracts had dried up during the pandemic. Small dairies across Oklahoma were closing at a rate of 2 per month. Sarah was getting 42 cents per gallon for milk that cost her 51 cents to produce. Every morning she woke up at 4:30, milked 50 Holsteins and lost money doing it. The feed bill alone was eating $4,000 a month. The equipment needed repairs she couldn't afford. And the bank, which had been patient while David was alive, started sending letters with new language in them. Words like restructuring, words like acceleration. Sarah wasn't just grieving. She was bleeding cash in a business model that had become a trap. But the third tragedy was the one that cut the deepest. Because it wasn't financial. It was identity. In a farming community, you are what you do. The Mitchells were dairy people. Earl had spent 34 years building a reputation as a man who kept his barns cleaner than his house, who never missed a cooperative meeting, whose word was better than a contract. And now his daughter-in-law, this city girl he had reluctantly grown to respect, was talking about selling the parlour, the equipment, the herd, the name. Earl didn't yell. He didn't have to. He looked at Sarah across the kitchen table one night in October while the kids were asleep upstairs, and he said, "You sell this dairy, and you sell my son's legacy. You sell every morning he got up before the sun. You sell the reason he died on that tractor." Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat on the porch swing where David used to drink his coffee, and she looked at the barn lights glowing in the dark, and she realized she wasn't just losing a husband. She wasn't just losing money. She was losing the right to call herself a Mitchell, and if she sold the dairy, she would never get it back. She walked the property at 2 in the morning and made a decision. She would sell the dairy while it still had value. She would take the money and build something new. Something that honored the land without destroying her. Something her children could inherit without debt. It wasn't surrender. It was strategy. But strategy looks like surrender when you're the only one who can see the board. The decision didn't come easy. Sarah spent 3 months trying to save the dairy. She tried direct-to-consumer bottling, but the startup costs for pasteurization equipment were $20,000 she didn't have. She tried agritourism, but Oklahoma winters don't bring many tourists to pet baby cows. She tried organic certification, but the transition period was 36 months, and she had 30 days before the bank moved. In January of 2022, Sarah signed the papers. She sold the milking herd to a cooperative in Kansas. She sold the equipment to a young couple starting up near Tulsa. She sold the name Mitchell Dairy to a corporate interest that would never set foot on the property. When the trucks pulled away with those Holsteins, Earl stood at the end of the driveway and didn't wave. He just watched, and when the last trailer disappeared around the bend, he turned and walked back to his house without a word. Sarah was left with the land, the barns, the debt, and $86,000 in cash from the sale. $86,000. In the farming world, that's not a fortune. That's a lifeboat with a hole in it. And Sarah was about to punch that hole wider. She had heard about a clearance auction in Amarillo, Texas. Not a regular livestock auction. A problem animal auction. The place where ranchers sent cattle that wouldn't breed, wouldn't fatten, or wouldn't stop trying to kill their handlers. The auctioneer there didn't use fancy language. He called things what they were: mean, ornery, demon. Sarah didn't know why she was drawn to it. Maybe it was the price tags. Maybe it was something darker. Maybe in her grief, she saw herself in those rejected animals. But she drove 6 hours through sleet to get there, and when she walked into that holding pen, she saw them. 3 miniature bulls. Not calves. Full-grown miniature zebu bulls. Standing 36 inches at the shoulder, with humps like camels and horns that curled like question marks. The first was black, with a white splash on his forehead. The second was red, scarred across the nose. The third was grey, the colour of storm clouds, pacing like a prisoner. The owner, an old rancher from New Mexico, spat tobacco and said, "Lady, these three are the reason I drink. The black one broke my nephew's arm. The red one put a man in the hospital. And the grey one? The grey one is smart. Smart is worse than mean. He watches you. He waits." The auctioneer wanted them gone. The crowd wanted entertainment, and Sarah wanted them. She paid $800 for the black one, $650 for the red, and the grey one, the smart one, she got for $400 because the auctioneer was tired of looking at him. $2,400 for three animals that the Agricultural Extension Office would have recommended destroying. Her father-in-law, when he found out, didn't speak to her for 6 weeks. Her neighbour, a man named Calvin Hobbs, who ran 200 head of Charolais, laughed so hard he had to lean against his truck. He said, "Sarah, you just traded 50 good milk cows for 3 lawn ornaments with attitudes. My wife buys garden gnomes that are bigger and cheaper. And they don't try to gore the mailman." Sarah didn't argue. She couldn't. Because within 72 hours of getting them home, the grey one, she named him Storm, proved every warning true. Sarah had set up a temporary pen in the old heifer barn, using panels she had found behind the equipment shed. She thought it would hold them. She was wrong. At 3 o'clock in the morning, her phone rang. It was the sheriff's department. Storm had bent a panel like aluminum foil, slipped through a gap no wider than a mailbox, and was standing in the middle of Route 66, staring down a semi-truck. By the time Sarah got there, flashing lights painted the asphalt red and blue. The truck driver was shaking. Storm wasn't. He stood in the center of the road like he owned it, and when Sarah called his name, he turned and looked at her with those black eyes. And for a moment, she felt something that wasn't fear. It was recognition. But recognition doesn't pay for a sheriff's overtime, and it doesn't fix the fence that Storm destroyed, and it doesn't cover the vet bill when the Red Bull. She called him Rust, slammed into a gate, and split his horn base wide open. Failure number 1. A $600 vet bill, a citation from the county for livestock at large, and a fence repair that took her 3 days in freezing rain. Calvin Hobbs drove by while she was digging post holes. He didn't stop. He honked and waved. Sarah cried in the mud that day, not because it was hard, because it was stupid, because she had taken the last of her safety net and turned it into 3 animals that seemed determined to prove her incompetence. But she didn't quit. She rebuilt the fence with steel posts set in concrete and hired Dr. Elena Vargas, a livestock behaviorist from the Extension Office who specialized in problematic bovines. For 2 months, things stabilized. Sarah learned their patterns. Storm watched from the highest point. Rust rubbed his horns against the oak tree. Midnight would let her scratch his forehead if she approached slowly. Then came failure number 2. Oklahoma spring is tornado season, but it's also the season of false hope. The grass comes back green. The air smells like possibility, and farmers start believing in good years. Sarah had just enough money left to buy their feed for 3 months. She had converted the old milking parlour into a handling facility with gates and chutes, thinking she was being smart. But she wasn't prepared for the weather. In late April, a storm system stalled over Caddo County and dumped 11 inches of rain in 48 hours. The heifer barn, which had always been adequate for mature Holsteins, became a swamp for animals that stood 3 feet tall. The water rose past their knees. The bedding rotted. And by the time the sun came back, Rust was coughing. Then Midnight went off feed. Then Storm developed a fever, so high Sarah could feel the heat coming off his body from 3 feet away. She called Dr. Vargas, who delivered the kind of news that makes livestock owners go numb. Pneumonia. All 3. Probably from wet conditions, stress, and a virus from the auction yard. The treatment was aggressive. Antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, fluids. Sarah spent 14 days sleeping in the barn, running IV lines, forcing electrolytes down throats, watching her last $3,000 evaporate into syringes. Midnight almost died on day 9. Sarah sat with him through the night, holding his head in her lap, talking to him the way she used to talk to David. She told him that if he died, she didn't know what she would do. At 4:17 in the morning, Midnight stood up. Wobbly, weak, but standing. Sarah cried again. Not because it was stupid, because it mattered. These 3 demons weren't just an investment, they were a lifeline. But failure number 3 was the one that nearly broke her. Because it wasn't physical, it was systemic. By June, the bulls were healthy. They had gained weight. Their coats were shining. Sarah had started posting pictures online. Not because she thought anyone cared, but because she needed to document something that felt like progress. And one day, a woman from a homesteading group in Colorado messaged her. "I love your minis," she wrote. "Do you breed?" Sarah stared at that message for an hour. Breed? She hadn't even thought that far ahead. She had 3 bulls. She needed cows to breed them to. She called every breeder in a 500-mile radius, and that's when she discovered the wall. The miniature cattle community was tight, elite, and deeply suspicious of outsiders, especially outsiders who owned 3 bulls that came from a problem auction. One breeder in Missouri laughed at her. Another in Kansas said, "Those aren't breeding bulls, honey. Those are coyote bait." Their bloodlines were unknown. Their temperaments documented as dangerous. No reputable breeder would risk their reputation on clearance auction animals. Sarah had 3 bulls that were finally healthy, finally contained, and finally worthless. She couldn't sell them for meat. The regulations were a maze. She couldn't breed them, no access to females, and no credibility. And she couldn't keep them. Her money was gone. The bank sent another letter. Foreclosure proceedings. Sarah sat on her kitchen floor with that letter in her hand, listening to her children argue upstairs. And she thought about calling Earl. She thought about admitting he was right. She thought about getting a job in town, letting the bank take the land, and walking away from everything that had made her feel like David's wife instead of David's widow. She thought about it for 3 days. And on the 3rd day, Storm looked at her, and something in that look said, "Not yet." The turning point didn't happen in a boardroom or at a breeders' conference. It happened because Sarah's daughter left a gate open. It was a Tuesday in July, hotter than blazes, and Sarah was in the house trying to figure out how to stretch $40 into groceries for a week. Her daughter, Maddie, had gone out to check the water troughs, a job she had begged for since she was 6, and Maddie, being 8 and dreamy, had forgotten to latch the south gate. By the time Sarah looked out the window, Storm, Rust, and Midnight were gone. Not in the road, not in the neighbour's field. They were in the north pasture. The north pasture was 40 acres of Johnson grass, ragweed, and thorny mesquite that had taken over after the dairy herd left. Sarah hadn't touched it in months. It was too overgrown to walk through, let alone manage. She grabbed a halter and ran. But when she got to the fence line, she stopped. Because what she saw didn't make sense. The 3 bulls weren't running. They weren't destroying anything. They were working. Storm was leading, pushing through the thickest brush, his horns catching vines and tearing them loose. Rust was behind him, trampling the pulled vegetation into the dirt, and Midnight was grazing on the tender shoots that the other two had exposed. They had formed a line, a processing line, and in the 2 hours they had been out there, they had cleared a path 20 yards wide through brush that would have taken a tractor days to cut. Sarah stood there with her mouth open. She knew about rotational grazing. She knew about using cattle to manage land, but she had never seen animals do it with this kind of intention, this kind of coordination. She called Dr. Vargas that night, babbling about what she had seen, and Dr. Vargas said something that changed everything. "Sarah, those aren't demons, those are landrace animals. The Zebu bloodline in miniatures was developed in India to work in brush, in heat, on marginal land. They were bred to be independent thinkers. What you call aggression, a rancher in Rajasthan calls survival instinct. They don't need a barn. They don't need a milking parlour. They need space. They need a job. And they need someone who understands that their behaviour isn't defiance. It's intelligence." Sarah didn't sleep that night. She researched miniature cattle land management and found something she had never seen before. A movement of small-scale regenerative farmers and homesteaders with 5 to 20 acres who didn't want a tractor the size of a house. They wanted animals that could clear brush, fertilize soil, and produce a calf every year without industrial infrastructure. Cattle that a single person could handle. Cattle that could live on grass that Angus cattle would starve on. And they were paying premiums. $8,000 for a bred heifer, $12,000 for a proven bull, $15,000 for a starter herd. But here was the accidental discovery. The premium wasn't for animals from established breeders. It was for animals that had been tested. Animals that had survived real conditions. Animals with documented temperaments, health histories, and ability to do actual work. Sarah didn't have a breeding program, but she had something better. She had 3 bulls that had survived pneumonia, escaped confinement, cleared brush, and transformed from demons into working partners. She had a story, and in the world of small-scale farming, story is currency. She started filming, not fancy videos, just her phone, propped on a fence post, showing Storm pushing through a thicket of blackberry brambles that had defeated her weed whacker. Showing Rust standing calmly while her son brushed his scarred nose. Showing Midnight at sunset, walking beside her without a lead rope. She posted them to a Facebook group called American Miniature Cattle Association, and she asked a question. Not to sell, to learn. She wrote, "I have 3 bulls that everyone told me were trash. They came from a problem auction. They broke my fences, cost me my savings, and nearly died in my barn. But today, they cleared an acre of brush in 2 hours and let my daughter braid ribbons in their tails. Are they actually valuable, or am I just desperate?" The response crashed her phone. Comments from Oregon, Vermont, Texas, Florida, homesteaders, retirees, former corporate workers who had bought land and didn't know what to do with it. They didn't want docile pets, they wanted capable partners. And Sarah's bulls, with their scars and their attitudes and their proven survival, looked like exactly that. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city or your country in the comments. I'm always amazed at how far these stories travel, and honestly, it helps me know who I'm talking to when I'm writing the next one. Within 48 hours, she had 12 serious inquiries. Within a week, a man from Austin had offered her $5,000 for Rust. She didn't sell. Because for the first time since David died, she wasn't desperate. She was strategic. And strategy looks a lot like hope when you've been hopeless for a long time. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened one decision at a time, one season at a time, one terrifying leap of faith after another. Sarah started with the land. She divided the north pasture into paddocks using temporary electric fencing that cost her $800. Money she made by selling the old dairy equipment that was rusting behind the barn. She rotated the bulls through the brush, letting them clear and fertilize each section before moving them. And she documented everything: dates, weather conditions, brush density before and after, weight gains, temperament notes. She created a data sheet that would have made David proud. By October of 2022, the north pasture was grazable. The Johnson grass was under control. The mesquite was beaten back. And Sarah had learned something that no extension office could have taught her. These bulls weren't just clearing land. They were improving it. The soil under their hooves was darker, richer, more alive than the soil in the untouched sections. Their manure, distributed naturally through rotation, was doing what synthetic fertilizers couldn't. It was building biology. Sarah started calling it the demon method, and she started telling people about it. In November, she attended her first livestock expo in Oklahoma City. Not as a buyer, as a learner. She walked every aisle, talked to every miniature breeder who would give her the time of day, and she asked one question: "What do your buyers actually want?" The answer surprised her. They didn't want perfect pedigrees. They didn't want show ring champions. They wanted animals that could survive, that could think, that could work on small acreage without requiring a full-time vet and a mortgage-worthy handling facility. Sarah went home and she made her first real business decision. She would not try to compete with the established miniature breeders who had been showing animals for decades. She would create a new category: working miniatures. Miniatures bred for land management, for meat production on marginal acreage, for homesteaders who needed cattle that paid for themselves instead of draining the bank account. To do that, she needed females. And she still didn't have the money for top-tier breeding stock. So she did something that made Earl finally break his silence and call her. She traded land for livestock. A woman in Arkansas had 3 miniature zebu cows. Unregistered, unproven, but healthy. The woman needed pasture for 6 months while she built her own facilities. Sarah offered her north paddock, already cleared and fertilized by the bulls, in exchange for breeding rights. The woman agreed, and in December of 2022, Sarah Mitchell officially became a breeder. The first calves came in September of 2023. 2 heifers and a bull calf. Sarah was in the barn when the first heifer stood up, wobbly and wet, and she named her Hope. Not because it was poetic, because it was accurate. By the end of 2023, Sarah had 9 head. 3 original bulls, 3 brood cows from the Arkansas trade, 2 heifer calves, 1 bull calf. She had sold the bull calf for $3,500 to a homesteader in New Mexico who drove 14 hours to get him. She had paid off the veterinary debt from the pneumonia outbreak, and she had made her first principal payment on the bank loan in 14 months. Earl came to the barn that Christmas. He didn't say much, but he brought a bag of apples for the bulls, and he scratched Rust's nose the way David used to. And when Rust leaned into his hand, Earl's eyes got wet. That was year 1, the year of survival. But year 2 was the year of scale. In January of 2024, Sarah did something she had promised herself she would never do again. She borrowed money. Not from the bank. From a private investor she met through the Miniature Cattle Association. A retired oil executive named Gerald who had bought 40 acres outside of Tulsa and wanted to turn it into a regenerative farm but didn't know how. He gave Sarah $20,000 in exchange for a partnership. He would fund the expansion. She would provide the expertise, the animals, and the management. They bought 2 more bred heifers from a dispersal sale in Missouri. They built a simple handling facility using panels and a roof. No concrete, no fancy chutes, just smart design that worked with the animals' instincts. And Sarah started offering land clearing packages. For $3,000, she would bring her bulls to your overgrown property for a month. They would clear the brush, fertilize the soil, and leave you with pasture ready for seeding. She had 3 clients by March, 6 by May. She was making more money in land management than she had ever made in milk. But the real explosion came from social media. One of her land clearing clients, a Texas homesteader with a popular YouTube channel, filmed a video about Sarah, not the animals. Sarah, the widow who sold her dairy, the woman who bought demons. The video got 400,000 views in a week, and Sarah's phone started ringing from California, Washington, New York. People who had never seen a cow were asking about miniature cattle and land management, and how to start a farm when everyone says you're crazy. Sarah hired her first employee in June of 2024. A local kid named Travis, who had dropped out of high school. She taught him stockmanship, how to read an animal's posture, how to move with their instincts, how to turn confrontation into conversation. By August, Travis was handling bulls alone. By September, Sarah had 23 head, had cleared land for 11 clients, and had a waiting list for calves that stretched into 2026. And she had done something that still makes me shake my head when I think about it. She had bought back the name. Not Mitchell Dairy, that was gone. But she had registered Mitchell Miniatures. And in agricultural extension newsletters, in the livestock papers, in the Facebook groups where homesteaders shared their dreams, Mitchell Miniatures became a name that meant something. It meant resilience. It meant proof. It meant that the animals everyone else threw away might be the answer you were looking for. Then came the boom. The miniature cattle boom of 2024 wasn't a slow build. It was a detonation. First, the price of beef hit record highs, while full-size operations struggled with feed costs, drought, and supply chain issues. Miniature cattle, which ate a fraction of what Angus ate and matured faster on grass, suddenly made economic sense. Second, the homesteading movement had created a generation of first-time landowners who wanted food security but didn't have capital for traditional livestock. Third, the regulatory environment shifted. Several states, including Oklahoma, passed exemptions for on-farm processing of miniature cattle under specific weight limits. You could now harvest a miniature steer on your property and sell the meat directly to consumers, bypassing corporate processing facilities. Sarah's bulls, which matured at 600 pounds instead of 1,400, fit that exemption perfectly. The market didn't just want her animals, it needed them. And Sarah, with her documented bloodlines, her proven land clearing results, and her story that resonated with a generation of people trying to reclaim their relationship with food, became the supplier of choice. In October of 2024, she held her first production sale, not at a clearance auction, at her farm. She set up tents, hired a catering truck, and invited the community that had once laughed at her. Calvin Hobbs came. He didn't laugh. He bought a bred heifer for $8,200. Earl came. He sat in the front row, and when Sarah's grey bull Storm walked into the ring, calm, massive, magnificent, Earl stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood. And in the farming world, that means more than any speech. The sale grossed $140,000. Sarah's cut, after paying Gerald his partnership percentage and covering expenses, was $91,000. She walked into the bank the next Monday and paid off the remaining loan balance. The loan officer, the same one who had sent the foreclosure letter, shook her hand and asked if she wanted to discuss a line of credit for expansion. Sarah said no thank you. She was done borrowing. She was done being desperate. She was done proving herself to people who had never believed in her anyway. The numbers tell a story that words can't. When Sarah sold her dairy in January of 2022, she was $180,000 in debt. Her monthly cash flow was negative $3,000. Her net worth, not counting the land that the bank was threatening to take, was approximately $12,000 in depreciating equipment and a pickup truck with 200,000 miles. Today, in 2024, Sarah Mitchell's operation is valued at just over $890,000. That includes 47 head of miniature cattle, 12 of which are proven breeding bulls and cows that command prices between $6,000 and $12,000 per animal. It includes 200 acres of managed rotational pasture that she cleared using her own animals, at zero cost in diesel or chemicals. It includes a land clearing business that generated $47,000 this year alone. And it includes something that doesn't show up on a balance sheet, but shows up in every decision she makes. Cash reserves. For the first time since David died, Sarah has money in the bank that isn't earmarked for a past due bill. She has $34,000 operating capital. She has no credit card debt. She has no vendor lines. And she has a waiting list of 43 families who have put down deposits for calves that haven't been born yet. The cattle boom didn't just save her farm. It redefined what her farm could be. Her daughter Maddie, who once drew bulls that looked like dragons, now has a college fund. Her son, who named his stuffed animal after Storm, is learning artificial insemination techniques from Dr. Vargas, who now works with Sarah as a consulting partner. Earl, who wouldn't speak to her for 6 weeks, now lives in the apartment above the old milking parlour and serves as the farm's official greeter, telling visitors the story of the 3 demons while he feeds them apples. And the grey bull, Storm? He sired 14 calves in 2024. His offspring have sold to buyers in 11 states. A breeder in Kentucky offered Sarah $25,000 for him last month. She declined. Some things, she says, aren't for sale. But here's the number that matters most to me. 3 bulls, $2,400, 3 years. That's all it took to go from foreclosure to freedom. From laughingstock to legacy. From a widow who didn't know how she would feed her children to a business owner who is teaching other widows, other single parents, other people who got told no, how to build something that lasts. The community that mocked her now drives for hours to attend her workshops. The banker who sent foreclosure letters now sends referrals. The neighbour who honked and waved while she cried in the mud now pays her to clear his back 40. And the auctioneer who laughed when she bought demons. He called her last month. He has a new lot of problem miniatures coming in. He wanted to know if she was interested. She said yes. But this time, she didn't pay $400. She didn't pay $800. She paid nothing. Because now, when Sarah Mitchell walks into that ring, the auctioneer doesn't laugh. He listens. He knows that what looks like a demon to everyone else might just be the next Mitchell Miniatures champion. And he knows better than to bet against a woman who has already proven that the only difference between trash and treasure is the eye of the person willing to see it. Sarah Mitchell didn't set out to prove anyone wrong. She set out to survive. And in surviving, she discovered something that I think about every time I tell this story. The value of an animal, like the value of a person, isn't determined by where it starts. It's determined by what it's allowed to become. Those 3 bulls were labelled demons because they didn't fit a system that wanted them docile, predictable, and interchangeable. They were too smart, too independent. Too much work for a dairy operation that needed machines, not partners. And Sarah was labelled crazy because she didn't fit the narrative that everyone had written for her. She was supposed to sell the farm, move to town, get a job at the grocery store, and raise her kids somewhere safe and small and forgettable. She was supposed to accept that her best days were behind her. She didn't, and neither should you. Whatever your demons are, whatever the world has labelled as unmanageable, worthless, or too much trouble, consider the possibility that the label is wrong. Maybe your demon just hasn't found the right environment yet. Maybe your demon is a gift wrapped in scar tissue. Maybe the thing everyone is laughing at today is the thing that will have them standing in silence tomorrow, watching you prove they never understood what they were looking at. If you're sitting there right now, in a situation that feels impossible, with debts that feel permanent angst, I need you to hear this. Sarah Mitchell had $12,000 in net worth, 3 aggressive bulls, and a father-in-law who thought she had destroyed his son's legacy. 3 years later, she has $890,000 in assets, a 47-head herd, and a community that drives for hours just to learn from her. The distance between those 2 realities isn't talent. It isn't luck. It isn't privilege. It's refusal. The refusal to quit when quitting makes sense. The refusal to accept the valuation that other people put on your life. The refusal to let one tragedy become a lifetime of tragedies. So here's what I want you to do. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you're trying to build, or someone you're trying to become, hit that subscribe button. Not because I need the number, but because I want to keep telling you stories like this. Stories that don't just entertain you for 12 minutes, but sit with you for 12 days. Stories that remind you that the comeback is always more powerful than the setback. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, someone who is holding their own demons, someone who is one step away from giving up, send them this video. Not because it's viral, because it might be the thing that keeps them going. Drop a comment below. Tell me about your demon. Tell me what the world has labelled as worthless in your life that you're determined to prove otherwise. I read every single one. And I promise you, the next story I tell might be inspired by what you write. Until then, remember this. They laughed when she bought demons. But demons, it turns out, are just angels with dirty faces. And Sarah Mitchell? She learned how to wash the dirt off, one day at a time.